Hello, welcome to episode number 15. A little slow in getting going today. The subject for this episode is, do you have it all figured out? And the reason I have actually been looking at this question, it seems that I noticed that for me, I always look at trying to figure things out. And there's a difference between trying to figure things out and being in the question about things and looking for the awareness of what you're asking for. Hi. And so I get that through what I realize that I do is that we definitely try to go figure things out. We look at a situation and you then, instead of going to question, you're like, okay, so why is this and why is that and so on and so forth, and sort of playing with the why instead of playing with the what is this? What do I do with it? Can I change it? So, and if so, how can I change it? Instead of going to those questions or any other questions that you could choose to go to, often you go to like, why? What is this? And then you go into this looping of trying to figure it out. And it's it's also interesting on how things show up, and then also not only how they show up, but also in how we look at things and how we see it affect our lives, and also when things show up in our life that we don't expect, that we are in the question of it. And so I'll give you a little bit of an example of something that happened to me basically in the last couple of days. So I'm working at this company, and this person that I work with that has always had my back at this company no longer works there. And so what I was starting to look at was, well, what was interesting is when I found out that they no longer work there, I was really sad, which is strange for me because stuff like that doesn't show up in my world normally at all. And it was really, really strange for me to have this sadness show up. And so I started looking at it, and I started looking at what it was for me, and the big thing that I did realize in this was that I realized that this person had my back. And then I started looking at where else in the company I could go, who else in the company would have my back. And there wasn't a lot showing up. And so I realized that with this person leaving, it would change quite dynamically my interaction within this. And so that was really interesting for me to look at. And that was one of the biggest awarenesses that I got out of looking at that and sort of asking, what was the sadness about? And it was really this awareness of like how much that would change in my world. And it wasn't like change, I ask for change all the time actually. And it isn't that change is bad. It's this change where it's not actually going to necessarily create greater. And we have this awareness. And the other thing that's really interesting is acknowledging what you actually are aware of. So it's also being in the question, and what are you aware of with this change showing up? And then with that change showing up, what else would you like to choose? And that's really the space that I'm in at this particular point of time, or in this 10 seconds, where it's being aware of what that has created in this particular situation, and then looking at what I would ultimately like to choose out of that, and what else is possible with all that. And so it was really interesting looking at that and being aware of it, and not going to the place of trying to figure it out. It's also going to the place of like knowing what it is that we are actually aware of, and how much awareness we don't acknowledge to ourselves, that we don't acknowledge that we are that aware of what's going on in our world. And so it's really playing with that. It's playing with these places where you don't actually go into conclusion automatically, where you look at something and you really start asking, what is my awareness of this? And then when you start getting an awareness of what is going on, then looking at that and going, okay, so what can I choose now? Or if I was choosing for me, what would I choose in this moment? What would I choose in this 10 seconds? And what else is possible in this 10 seconds as well? And so it's really playing with these different questions that we can use. And still one of my favorites is, what's right about me that I'm not getting? And playing with that one. And the other thing too is what can be fun, and I've mentioned this before, is you can actually go to somebody else in your life, and somebody that definitely adores you. And I know I've spoken about this before, but I highly recommend it. And if you're in a place where you are really judging yourself dynamically, ask them the question, what do you see about me that I don't see? And see what shows up, because it's interesting. Even if you play with this yourself, ask yourself, like somebody that you do have a lot of regard for and so on, ask yourself, ask yourself to see them see you through their eyes. And that's another thing to play with. Yeah, what if the universe always has your back? Absolutely. And often we don't have our own back. And so that's really the biggest thing. It's like being aware that we may not to choose to have our own back. And, and what if we did? What would that change? So yeah, that's a great question too. What if the universe always has your back? And so it's been an interesting last few days. It was funny, this morning I was asking for change, and a lot of change actually showed up in a very, very short period of time. Actually, from the time that I said it to the time that I actually, it was probably like 5 minutes later, I got an email that the place we're in, they found new renters. And so we've been looking to move out, and as part of the deal, we have to find other people to take over our lease. And so that happened. So change is all about, and that is probably something that I ask for constantly. And what else can be created with that change, and what else is possible that none of us have ever considered as a possibility, and what else can show up now. And it's really interesting, this this place where you do go to trying to figure it out, or you go to thinking, and you go to looking. I guess in some ways, like the figuring out is looking for the answers instead of looking for the question and the awareness. And how often do you do that? And how often do you actually already have the awareness that you haven't yet acknowledged? And really playing with that awareness and asking, what am I aware of here? What am I perceiving? What do I actually know? And it's interesting because there's been a few times lately where I have actually been aware of something but didn't acknowledge that awareness. And as things unfolded, I became aware that I was aware far earlier than I was willing to acknowledge that I was aware. And how aware are we? And really, I see it as not necessarily being, it's the willingness to be aware, but it's also the willingness to ask the question of your awareness. And it's like, how actually aware are we all? And how often do we not acknowledge it? And by not acknowledging it, invalidating ourselves by not acknowledging that we are actually aware. And so it's been interesting a few times that's been showing up lately, which has been really neat actually to see that, to see situations show up and not acknowledging it until way later, but also acknowledging when you do acknowledge it, and also really playing with like, okay, so if I was actually aware right now, what would I be aware of that I haven't acknowledged? And so that's a really good question you can play with. What am I actually aware of that I haven't acknowledged? Because you have the awareness already. It's not like the awareness isn't there. It's there. It's in most cases that you just haven't been willing to acknowledge that you are actually aware. And when you do acknowledge your awareness, more of it can show up and more of it will show up. And so that's definitely something that I've been playing with. And it's funny because one of the questions that I've now talked about many times is what's right about me that I'm not getting, that I've been playing with. And it's interesting, what has been showing up is some of this acknowledging the awareness that I already have that I haven't been willing to acknowledge. So it's really neat and again, all these things show up in a way that you don't really intend, or they show up in a way that you never thought they would. It's kind of like everything is the opposite of what it appears to be, and nothing's the opposite of what it appears to be. And so it's really playing, just being in the allowance for that to show up, being in the allowance for it to show up however it shows up, in whatever way it shows up. And the other thing that's been interesting is like it's been fun kind of looking at people in my life and seeing how they play and in what way they play, and looking at what would be fun, or if playing in a different way or choosing in a different way would work for me. And so it's been neat looking at that, and also realizing that a lot of what I have been choosing is actually what works for me. So great question. What can I acknowledge that I'm aware of? Of what I'm aware of. Totally. Like it's amazing how much awareness we actually have. I think that's probably the most understated thing in our world, is actually how aware we are. How little we're willing to acknowledge of how truly aware we are. And what's really interesting with that is it's simply the acknowledgement of our awareness, which is so dynamic. It was really interesting. This brings me to a conversation I had with my mom the other day. She just moved recently from one place to another. And she was noticing that she's had this thing show up in her world where she's worried about money. And she's like, it's really strange because that's not me, basically. Like, I never worry about money. Like, it's not like she has a lot of money, but she doesn't require a lot, and she's really happy with the way it shows up in her world. And so she was starting to have these doubts around money. Like, she was looking at doing a small vacation at the end of in the end of the summer, and she was looking at like, oh, maybe I shouldn't do it because of this and this and this. And she's like, it's really strange. Like, I've never had this. And, you know, kind of what is it? And so I asked her, I said, well, you've moved recently. Could it be that you're aware of all the people around you, and that the people around you, for whatever reason, have maybe some more limitations or more worry around money, and you're just aware of that? And again, like, it's this awareness that we have, which is pretty amazing. Like, we are aware to a degree which is actually frightening. And she's like, yeah, because I know it's not mine. I know this thing isn't mine because it's just not me. And so, yeah, I'm like, you have this awareness of, you know, the people around you that have, you know, maybe more worry around money, and you're just aware of it. It doesn't have to be yours. And so it's really acknowledging how aware we are, and that we don't need to choose from buying any of the stories of the awarenesses that show up in our world. And I also had another conversation with someone while we were running bars this week, and it was this conversation around being an infinite being, and the question of like, would an infinite being choose this? And it's like, well, if you're truly an infinite being, then nothing is yours. Literally nothing. And everything is yours. And so it's really, how much awareness do we have of everything, and that nothing of it is ours and everything is ours, because we are part of the infinite that is everything. Just like consciousness excludes nothing and judges nothing. So what if you were just extremely aware of everything that goes on with everybody all the time? You just never acknowledge that you're actually aware of that much. And it's really cool because this particular subject, it's fun to play with children. Why? Because children tend to be willing to acknowledge how aware they actually are. And I had a really cool conversation with my niece. She's now, she's almost 13 or 14. I should know this. So she's 13 or 14, and she had some things going on in her world. Actually, she had a really intense headache. And so we were at a family gathering, and I went and I talked to her. I said, so, you know, is it yours? And she's like, no. And I'm like, are you just really, really aware of every single person that you come in contact with when you walk into a room? And you basically know exactly what's going on with everyone. And she's like, yeah. And I asked her a few other questions, and what was interesting about that, there was no resistance in her world. She just was able to express what was, and had the willingness to do so. And was probably willing to acknowledge for the first time in her life that she had these capacities. She's a tremendous healer. She heals all the time. That she's a walking healer, and to her that's normal. But she never acknowledged that it isn't actually normal for everyone else. And I said, you don't actually have to heal everybody. You can choose not to. It's actually a choice. And it's not a wrongness to choose whatever works for you. And so she got that, and it was really interesting. And she was answering all these questions, and they happened they were with so much ease that came out of her mouth, to the point where I actually asked, is she just answering the questions because she's aware of that she wanted to please me, because she loves pleasing people? And I got to know, it was really interesting. It was actually, that was just what was up in her world, and she was really in a space of no point of view and no judgment of anything, and just was willing to express what was. And so it was really cool to see how when you're willing to really just acknowledge what is, then you have choice. You have choice for anything. And it's so fun to see. When you're younger, you tend to be more willing to see what is and acknowledge what is than as people get older, because then you buy all these points of views as you go through life. And it was really cool, because I went and saw a movie last night called A Wrinkle in Time, which I read the book some years ago. And it was really cool because in the book it was basically this one young girl and her little brother, and it really in the movie it really showed the little brother how open he was to being willing to be aware of what actually is that you cannot see in the world, and willing to play in that world all the time, and trust his knowing for what was true for him. And it was a really neat movie, because it talks a lot about space and what is possible, and it really looks at these points of views of all these conclusions we have around time. The whole concept was really wrinkling time, or folding it, something that isn't new, but being able to go places, that are billions of years away in a nanosecond. And it really, really touched on what is possible and how few people are maybe willing to see what is possible. And it's a really cool movie, actually. If you get a chance to see it, I definitely recommend it. And it just kind of it talks a lot about light and dark and so on, which is interesting. And it really just talks about choice and what you're capable of. And what if you're willing to acknowledge the potency that you truly be? And that's really that was the main thing that I got out of the movie, was this little girl who was extremely potent and wasn't willing to acknowledge her potency. And it was really cool because they showed some stuff about her being sort of bullied at school, in a sense. And if you've been around for the conversation around that in Access, that any sort of bullying or abuse, whatever kind of abuse it would be, is people choose you to abuse you most of the time because they know you're powerful. And their point of view is that if they can somehow win or control you, then they can do that with anyone. But they will choose you because you are so powerful. And it really shows that in this movie, because this girl who thinks she's not powerful and doesn't acknowledge her potency is actually extremely potent. And what's kind of cool is that we actually all are that potent. We all have that within us to create something that hasn't been created yet in this world. And so what is possible if you're willing to acknowledge your awareness and what you actually are aware of? And if that was the constant question throughout your day, throughout your life, it's like, what am I actually aware of? And that will give you the awareness, and also give you information to choose, to then potentially choose something different than that you have never chosen before. And so, and what would your life be like? What else would be possible that you've never considered if you're willing to acknowledge how aware you actually are and how much you actually perceive, know, be, and receive? And I don't know how I'm doing on time, but I'm probably running a bit long, but there's one other thing that kind of popped into my world, and that's around receiving. I was at I take a trading course once a week, and which is really amazing. And I was at this trading course, and there's these two new members, a woman and a man. And the man, he was there last week, and this week he's there again. Both of them were there, and so he introduced himself to me this time, and I said hello, and we sort of, whatever. And then the woman, I was going to introduce myself to her, and in her world there was no introduction. She had created this wall, this barrier, and it was like, we're not doing this. And so I was looking at that today, and I was like, for whatever reason, which doesn't matter to me at all, she chose to cut herself, to put up this wall, which was a barrier to me and a barrier to her. And I really saw in that moment how little she was willing to receive, and how by creating that separation, receive anything. And I get that it's not everything, but if you're not willing to receive something, anything, it doesn't matter what it is, you're basically cutting off your receiving for what's totally possible and receiving any kinds of energies whatsoever. And I really look at it in an energetic way, whether it's judgment, whether it's whatever, it's still energy. And if you're not willing to receive any of that, and it's talked about a lot, you're literally not willing to receive. And how does that show up in your life? When you're not willing to receive you, when you're not willing to receive people around you, when you're not willing to receive possibilities, when you're not willing to receive money, when you're not willing to receive judgment, when you're not willing to receive, it's all these things that you're not willing to receive. And how much limitation does that create in your world? So it's just something that I just became aware of, that I was like, wow, just seeing what this person was choosing in that 10 seconds, I was aware of how much that limits you when you choose that. How much that you're actually cutting yourself off from you and everything else. And so whatever you become aware of that you're not willing to receive, and whatever judgment you put on it, that and justification of not receiving it, and if you didn't have that, what else would be possible, and how much would your world change if you were actually willing to receive all that, whatever it was, and had no projections, no expectations, no judgments, on what receiving actually looks like. So with that, thank you so much. I think that's the end of this week's show. So really, how much, if I was willing to acknowledge what I actually know, what would I know? And if I was willing to receive everything with no judgment, what could show up? Thank you so much for joining. We'll play again next week, same time. And have an awesome day or evening and weekend coming up or whatever. Thanks so much. We will see you later. Bye.